So the Plague Marines of Mortarion are back and they're stronger than ever. Today we're looking through the 4 rules for Codex Death Guard and talking through the strength of all the rules. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're back for another full Codex review, now the new Death Guard Codex is out in its full glory. In the video we'll be talking through every single section of rules for match play, and I will be looking to cover the Crusade rules in another video. My first impressions are that it seems like a really strong book. Multiple units have got significantly tougher, the special rules seem very nice indeed, and in particular the Terminators and Mortarion are looking really scary. Let's jump into it then and see what we've got. So here are the core army rules for Codex Death Guard then. They've got a generic section on the actual rules for the army, including restrictions on certain units, a new discussing the Resilient rule, and the tweaked versions for Inexorable Advance and Remorseless, and a new Contagions of Nurgle ability, which means if you're running a full Death Guard list, then your enemies are going to have -1 toughness a lot of the time. As you'd expect, they have a full table of Warlord Traits and Relics, Psychic Powers, Stratagems, and the new secondary objectives, and then a few things that are unique to the Death Guard, including their Plague Companies, where they get a unique Warlord Trait, Relic, and Stratagem, and Deadly Pathogens options, where you can spend a few points to make your Plague Champions' weapons even stronger. Finally, there are an absolute ton of changes to the datasheets. Perhaps most standout are 2 Wound Plague Marines and 3 Wound Terminators, a new Lord of Virulence and Miasmic Malignifier datasheets for the Codex, and pretty much every other unit has had its rules tweaked in some way, the vast majority getting stronger in my opinion. So let's go through the book then, starting with the core army rules and how it functions, moving on through the Warlord Traits, Relics, and other unique rules options, and finishing up with a talk through how the datasheets have changed. So first up, let's start with the core army rules for the Death Guard. As we saw leaked yesterday, there are some restrictions on certain units. There's a new Lord of the Death Guard special rule, which means that you can only have 1 Captain equivalent model per detachment. That includes the Death Guard Lords, Lord of Contagion, Lord of Virulence, the Death Guard Demon Prince, and Typhus. A bit of a shame it's so limited. If you do want more than one of these models, you're going to have to take 2 different detachments and sacrifice a few CP. The second is a restriction to the amount of Horde units you can field. You can only take 1 Poxwalker and 1 Cultist unit per core Death Guard infantry choice. Again, we talked about that yesterday. It basically means that the Death Guard army is going to have at least some focus on Plague Marines. It can't just be the hangers-on. Though Death Guard core infantry units do include things like the Terminators and Possessed, it doesn't even necessarily mean that you have to field any Plague Marines, but I'm afraid it does kind of curb the excesses of the zombie horde strategy that you can use. You're not going to be able to run a list with something like 300 Poxwalkers at 2,000 points, which you would have been able to do otherwise. Finally, there's a rule for the feated Virion units. These are essentially the Death Guard elite buffing characters, things like the Tallyman and Plague Surgeon, and these just make them a little bit easier to include in detachments, where you can take any 3 of them in one elite slot. Quite nice, as the elite slot can get quite congested otherwise. Most units get a Plague Company tag, which means that they're from one of the 7 Plague Companies. Each detachment has to be from the same Plague Company, and quite a lot of aura abilities and buffs tend to buff models from the same Plague Company, not different ones. Finally, we have some fairly generic buffs to units. We'll talk about discussing Resilience and Contagions of Nurgle in a second, but they also have Inexorable Advance, Remorseless, and Malicious Volleys. Notably though, 2 rules have disappeared. There's no more Hateful Assault for getting +1 attack on the charge. Basically just every single Death Guard unit has gone up by 1 attack, so you get that attack all the time now, not just conditionally, so it's kind of a good thing. And also Death to the False Emperor has gone. You don't get exploding 6s for fighting Imperial units anymore. Bit of a shame to lose a strong buff against a common matchup, but frankly I think the Death Guard are going to be hideously scary in melee anyway. First up for the rules that they do have though is Inexorable Advance. This is kind of like the Death Guard chapter tactic, and it basically means that you always count as stationary for shooting, so you'll be getting those malicious volleys off with the bolters at 24 inches with Plague Marines. They'll be able to stride forward 5 inches per turn, and then still be putting out 2 bolter shots. Vehicles get no -1 for shooting in melee at units that engage them. And finally, infantry suffer no modifiers to their movement. They won't be slowed by difficult terrain, or any other abilities that might limit them charging. They might be already quite slow, but nothing's going to make them any slower, which I think feels quite thematic. In addition, they also have Remorseless, which means there's no modifiers to combat attrition. This is now basically the dark mirror of the Adeptus Astartes, and they show no fear ability, basically meaning they never suffer any -1 to combat attrition tests. Finally, that Malicious Volleys rule, as we said, it'll always mean that Plague Marines and Terminators will be firing at max shots with their bolt weapons at 24 inches, so they'll have a decent amount of strength 4 shooting pouring out of the ranks of Plague Marines. Moving on, let's talk about the 2 most important rules for the Death Guard. As we saw previewed before, Disgustingly Resilient is no longer a 5+ feel no pain, it's now a flat -1 to the damage on Death Guard units. Combined with the extra wound that Plague Marines and Terminators get, in general those units got tougher against basically all weapons, but particularly so against damage 2 weapons, who effectively have their damage output halved by this rule. It is a little bit worse against dedicated anti-tank weapons that are firing against demon engines, but is still a powerful defensive buff. Some people like the change, some people really hate it. Either way, I'd argue it's still a very powerful rule, and it does cut down on the amount of dice you have to roll. Having said that though, I did predict in a previous video that the Plague Surgeon might get a feel no pain type rule, and he certainly has. That means that you can easily have ranks of Plague Marines now with -1 damage, and also a 6+ feel no pain. With that on Plague Marines or Terminators, it's just going to be an absolute nightmare to get rid of them. In addition, the Death Guard have also gained the Contagions of Nurgle special rule. This one's been heavily previewed on Warhammer Community, and it is an excellently powerful rule. Contagions of Nurgle is an ability that your whole army gets, provided your entire army is Death Guard and you aren't mixing in with demons or other chaos. Any enemy units that are within Contagion range get -1 to their toughness, both against ranged and melee attacks from Death Guard units. This Contagion range is nearby to all of your Death Guard army, and it gets a wider and wider aura throughout the game. On Battle Round 1 it's only 1 inch range, so essentially units that are in melee. Battle Round 2 it's 3 inches, Battle Round 3 it's 6 inches, and Battle Round 4 and 5 it's 9 inches, meaning that probably the majority of your enemy's units are going to be -1 toughness. Some units get buffs to this range, and some units get an automatic 9-inch range, such as Mortarion or the Miasmic Malignifier fortification. -1 toughness is just an enormously powerful ability, and it makes the Death Guard's sort of mediocre damage output turn into something that's far nastier than it should be. For example, Plague Marines with Plague Knives in combat with Space Marines will now be wounding them on a 3+, re-rolling 1s, and basically punching far above their weight. This same Contagion ability rule also applies to certain Warlord Traits, where the Warlord Traits will give you a different rule that also uses the Contagion range on this chart. A couple of those are really powerful, and we'll get onto those in a bit. They're the Warlord Traits from the Plague Companies. Before we get onto those specific ones though, we'll get onto the standard Warlord Traits that any Death Guard unit can take. As normal, we have 6, Revoltingly Resilient, which is a 5+ feel no pain type save, which when combined with Disgustingly Resilient will make your model ridiculously hard to shift. Honestly not a bad pickup on something like a Demon Prince. 8 wounds with -1 damage and a 5+ feel no pain isn't going anywhere fast. Next we have Living Plague, which means that units within 3 inches can't use aura abilities. Probably wouldn't be my go-to, but it will see play quite a bit on Mortarion, who incidentally gets Revoltingly Resilient for that 5+ feel no pain, Living Plague for not using aura abilities, and also Arch Contaminator, which we'll get onto in a second. Mortarion gets literally 3 of these Warlord traits, and also gets an extra one of the Plague type Warlord traits out of the Plague Companies. Basically, if you include him in a Death Guard army, he is definitely going to be your Warlord, have half of these in play, and he can also pick other ones to be used by using a stratagem. When used on Mortarion, I think that Living Plague could actually be really handy. It means that anyone trying to get into close combat with him won't be getting any buffs, which doesn't bode well for them trying to kill him in combat. Next we have Hulking Physique, which is +1 wound, and he can only be wounded on a 4+. Again, another excellent defensive buff, kind of similar in potency to Revoltingly Resilient to be honest. Though I think of the two I'd rather have Revoltingly Resilient, as it provides protection against low strength shots and mortal wounds. Next up we have Arch Contaminator, often a go-to, though it has been nerfed slightly. Now it's quite a close range buff, and it only applies to core units within 6 inches. It gives them 4 rerolls to wound with plague weapons against targets that are less than 12 inches away or in melee. Really powerful on lower strength things like Plague Marines with Plague Knives, or perhaps Blightlord Terminators with Bale Swords. Could be good in combination with Virulent Rounds to make bolt weapons plague weapons for a turn. Next we have Rotten Constitution, which is +1 toughness, and you get to ignore AP -1 and AP -2. They both count as AP 0. Yet another very solid defensive buff here. Again though, I'd be tempted to take Revoltingly Resilient first. Finally we have Foul Effluence. This one's a little bit weaker in my opinion. At the end of your movement phase, units within 6 inches roll a dice, and on a 4+ they take 1 mortal wound. Obviously that's enemy units, not friendly ones. For me, most of these are quite good. Arch Contaminator is the best buffing one. Then I'd be tempted by Revoltingly Resilience for the durability, and of course if you have Mortarion on the table, he is going to be your given Warlord, though you can buy some of these other traits in for 1 command point each. Next up, let's talk through the Relics, and besides the ones from the Plague Companies, we have 9 to choose from. The Reaper of Glorious Entropy is a boosted Man Reaper or Plague Reaper, but it doesn't get this new double attack mode that the Man Reapers get, but it doesn't get any -1 to hit either. It's just a flat strength ×2, AP -3, damage 3 attack, and if you want a fighty Death Guard Lord of Contagion, it's a very decent choice. Next we have the Plague Skull of Glothilla, which basically gives you a once per game mortal wound bomb. You can select an enemy unit less than 6 inches away, you roll 7d6, on a 4 to 5 they get 1 mortal wound, and on a 6 they get d3 mortal wounds. Perhaps not the worst use of a command point ever if you get to deploy it. On average you're going to be getting around about 4 mortal wounds on the opponent. Next up we have the Demon's Toll, which can only be taken by the Noxious Blightbringer, and that gives you a no fallback ability once per game. An enemy unit within 6 inches can't fall back on the roll of a 2+. Bit of a shame it's only a once per game ability, otherwise it'd be very strong. Not being able to fall back is a really powerful boost, but it's just got a bit questionable value when it's only once per game, it's on a fairly slow moving character, and it's not even necessarily guaranteed to go off. Next we have Fugaris' Helm, which is a +3 inches to aura abilities. Nice and straightforward, good on pretty much any character, though excellent on the Plague Surgeon, making that 6+ feel no pain ability just go that little bit further. Very solid, I'm sure it will see play. Next we have the Putrid Periapt, which is on a Plague Caster or Sorcerer. It allows you to know 1 more power from the Discipline of Contagion, and once per game when you've casted a power successfully, you heal d3 wounds on the Psyker. This one's a pass for me, I'm afraid. If it would allow you to cast another time, then it would be great, otherwise I just don't think it's all that strong. Next up, and far more positively, we have Tollkeeper, which is a buff to the Tallyman's ability. It's a 6-inch aura, where ranged attacks with core units gain exploding 6s. If you get a 6 to hit, you get 1 additional hit on the foe. Now, as we'll get onto, the Tallyman is already a much improved buff character compared with previously, and this really makes him something that you'd like to have in the core of your army. Essentially, it's a plus 25% boost to your shooting on core units, and it's a really good option to make a cheap character into a buffing monster. If you're taking a Tallyman, I think that this will definitely be considered. Next up we have the Revolting Stench Vats. This is an upgrade for the Foul Blight Spawn, who had his aura ability slightly nerfed. On his core datasheet it's now 3 inches rather than 7 inches, but you can take this relic to make the aura go back up to 6 inches instead, usually robbing your opponent of the ability to fight first. Next we have the Suppurating Plate, which has been a little bit nerfed. It still gives you a 2+ armor save, so now if you lose any wounds, the enemy takes a single mortal wound on the roll of a 2+. Still not bad to make a tanky character even more so, though its mortal wound potential is a little reduced. Finally we have a relic sword called Plaguebringer. Its strength +2, AP -2 and flat damage 2, and casualties caused by it count as double the casualties for the purposes of morale tests. I guess not the worst on a standard Chaos Lord, though not really significantly better than something like a Power Fist. So a fair few good choices of relics here. My picks would be the Helm for extra auras, Tollkeeper for a big boost to shooting, and perhaps the Reaper for an extra fighty character. As an alternative to relics though, you can take Deadly Pathogens instead and apply it to your regular war gear. You can use it in any Death Guard detachment, and they act as weapon upgrades for a set amount of points, or they cost 1 power level each if you're playing by power level. You can apply these pathogens to a plague weapon carried by any non-named character or any unit champion, and you can't use them on grenade weapons or relics. Finally, you can only have 1 per character, though you can potentially have both a relic and a deadly pathogen weapon, which is quite nice, so you could combine one of these with, say, the Suppurating Plate to make the character tougher. So here's the points cost list for the pathogens and exactly what they do. All of them will give you +1 strength to the weapon, so quite a nice little boost there, and then they get a second effect depending on exactly how many points you pay. Acidic Malady is 20 points and improves the AP by -1, best on lower AP weapons, maybe things like Plague Spewers or perhaps a Man Reaper that's fighting with the anti-horde mode with Scythe. Explosive Outbreak is 20 points, this one gives you exploding 6s to hit, so each roll of 6 to hit grants you 1 additional hit. It does cost 20 points, but it's a solid offensive boost to a really fighty character. Again, things like Plague Reapers are going to be my go-to. Virulent Fever for 20 points gives you a chance for mortal wounds on 6s. Personally, I'm not convinced that this one is worth 20 points. Unless you've got a weapon with absolutely tons of attacks like that Twin Plague Spear, you're going to be averaging less than 1 mortal wound per time that you attack with the weapon. Not convinced that that's worth 20 points for an upgrade. Befouling Runoff is 10 points for Ignores Cover. Not too bad for only 10 points with +1 strength as well, but it is kind of situational. Unstable Sickness is 15 points. That means that each enemy model killed gives you a 4+ chance to deal an additional mortal wound to the enemy. Again, kind of situational, will be really good against Horde type units, but kind of meh against Space Marines and useless against vehicles. Corrosive Filth for 20 points is powerful against vehicles, but not against anything else. He gets +1 damage against vehicles. so again probably best on a high strength, high AP weapon such as a Plague Reaper or Man Reaper. And finally Viscous Death, the one that they showed off, is possibly the best on the list, mainly because it only costs 10 points, you get the +1 strength, and you get to reroll the number of attacks made by a multi-shot weapon. It's a very solid boost to either the Lord of Virulence's Twin Plague Spewer, or the Foul Blight Spawn's Plague Sprayer, which gets him to strength 8. Out of these, I would say that Viscous Death is probably my favourite, because it's so cheap and provides 2 meaningful buffs. Otherwise, I quite like Acidic Malady for the extra AP -1, and Exploding Outbreak for the exploding 6s to hit. I suspect that only Viscous Death is really that much of an auto-include though, the rest are kind of take or leave. Next, let's talk about the spells for the Death Guard in the Contagion Discipline. Miasma of Pestilence is Warp Charge 6, it's still great, and gives any one Death Guard unit a -1 to hit, likely one of the go-tos for your Plague Casters. It's just awesome if you combine it on a big tanky unit that's really threatening. Something like a big unit of Terminators or Mortarion himself are pretty much the ideal targets. Gift of Contagion for Warp Charge 5 is a malediction which targets an enemy unit within 18 inches. It gives them -1 strength, and if you cast on an 8 or more, then it's -1 strength and -1 attack. A useful one to have around. This could really do over a tooled up enemy melee unit who thought they might be able to tangle with your Death Guard, but has the potential to hit them with 2 quite major nerfs. Next up we have Plague Wind, which is a Warp Charge 6 Witchfire. Again, it's an 18-inch range one, and you roll 1d6 for every model in the unit. On a 6 they take a mortal wound, and if you cast it on a 9+, that becomes a 5+ to take a mortal wound. I quite like the chance of getting a lot of extra damage on a 9+. Still though, I'm not sure I would take it in an army, it just seems very niche in an anti-horde kind of way, or against the majority of units, and unless you're targeting something with 10 models or more, I'd probably just go with Smite. Next up we have Putrescent Vitality for Warp Charge 7. This is a blessing that affects Death Guard infantry and gives them +1 strength and toughness. Both very useful buffs. I think it could be particularly nasty on a big squad of Plague Marines with Plague Knives. Making them strength 5 while the enemy's -1 toughness means they're going to be wounding a lot of things really effectively. Plus it could make Death Guard, Terminators or Plague Marines just even more annoying to shift. Maybe it could be fun on Poxwalkers this one as well. Next we have Curse of the Leper for Warp Charge 6. This one's a Witchfire, and it has to target the closest unit within 18-inch range. You roll 7d6, and for each roll that exceeds the enemy toughness value, it causes 1 mortal wound. It's basically a similar damage output to Smite when you do it on Space Marines or Toughness 4 models, but significantly better against anything that's Toughness 3. Could be an interesting reaction with the Contagion range though. If you can get models within Contagion range and make them -1 toughness, then you're going to get a lot more mortal wounds. Finally, we have Gift of Plagues, which is a Warp Charge 6 blessing, and it makes any Death Guard unit +6 inches to their Contagion range to a maximum of 12 inches. You could have a 7-inch Contagion range unit right from turn 1, or maybe it could be nice on something like a Feated Bloat Drone moving up towards the enemy on turn 2. They'd have a 9-inch Contagion range, and you could aim to make a large portion of the enemy army -1 toughness for the rest of your guns to fire at. Overall, I still think that Miasma of Pestilence will be one of the go-tos. It's just excellent for making a scary Death Guard unit ludicrously tough, with most of the rest being decently powerful. Putrescent Vitality is still really good for buffing infantry, and Gift of Contagion is a really powerful debuff for all the scary melee units that we see in 9th edition. Next, let's get into the many stratagems available to the Death Guard. They have no less than 31 strats, plus an extra 7 that are present in their Plague Companies, though I'm afraid a few of the old favourites are gone or significantly changed. To be honest, I'm not too surprised at this. I think Death Guard are one of the factions that had the single highest number of stratagems after Psychic Awakening, so it doesn't really surprise me too much that a few of them haven't made it through. The majority of the ones that are here still seem very good. First up, we have a couple of decent buffs that I think will be great on Plague Marines in melee. Trench Fighters for 1 command point gives you +1 attack with Plague Knives. Theoretically, if you equip them for melee, you could have a 20-strong unit of Plague Marines with 3 attacks each. This will make them 4 attacks each, with 80 attacks at Plague Knives, strength 4 AP -1, and of course the enemies at a nice -1 toughness. You could then stack that with Creeping Blight, which allows any of your wound rolls of 6s to go off on an AP -4. That would be really lovely in combination with Arch Contaminator, the Warlord Trait, getting you significantly more 6s with those plague weapons. That combo is going to shred a whole ton of infantry and do a decent amount of damage to heavies as well. Next up we have Fire Fever, which gives Hellbrutes +1 to hit and +1 to wound, provided they fire all their guns against one target. It's not too bad, but you are only buffing 1 unit with that, and I'm not sure that shooty Hellbrutes are necessarily the most efficient option. Maybe if you budgeted the command points for it, it could make one of them a usable option in the army. Next we have Vermid Whispers for 1 command point. This gives you +1 to hit for your Terminators, either in shooting or assault. Definitely a nice to have, particularly as you could get that off on so many Terminators at once. Imagine a full squad of 10 Blightlord Terminators with 2+ to hit. Next we have a really interesting one called Haze of Corruption. It means that when a Death Guard core unit fights, if you kill any enemy models and there's excess damage done by their weapons, say you had a damage 2 Man Reaper kill a 1 wound model, then the excess damage spills over to another model, allowing a unit with high damage weapons to pretty much obliterate hordes. For me this sounds excellent on paper, but I'm just not sure how often you'd really want to use it in game. It's quite expensive CP wise, and Death Guard do tend to deal with hordes of light chaff infantry quite easily, and this is going to have limited use against heavies. Next up we have our 2 command point Eternal Hatred, which I believe is the new incarnation of Veterans of the Long War. Basically any Death Guard infantry unit shooting or fighting will get +1 to the wound roll, a nice flat uncomplicated damage buff when you need just maximum damage against one target, and of course it's going to be most efficient on huge units. This will likely be the pattern for Veterans of the Long War when Chaos Space Marines Codex comes out. Next up we have Mutant Strain for 1 CP. This is where Poxwalkers can risk some damage to themselves to put some mortal wounds on the enemy. When they're in melee, each time they roll a hit roll of a 6 they deal 1 mortal wound to the enemy target, but each time they do a hit roll of a 1 they cause 1 mortal wound to themselves. At just 5 points a model, this is likely to be more of a problem for the enemy unit than for yours, and you are actually going to get quite a lot of mortal wounds out of this. With a 10-man Poxwalker squad, you're going to be getting an average of just over 3 on the enemy and 3 on yourselves, which could well be worth it if you do really need your Poxwalkers just to drag down an enemy character or something. Next for 1 CP we have Diseased Effluence, and this allows you to have your character to take 1 mortal wound of damage and then cause 2d3 mortal wounds on the enemy unit. If that unit happens to be a character though, they only take d3, not 2d3. Could be a pretty nice trade-off if you do want to drag down some really elite enemy combatants with you. Maybe things like Space Marine Blade Guard with their high saves and invul saves could be a good choice. Next we have a Spawn buffing power. Grandfather's Influence gives 1 squad of Spawn +1 toughness and Disgustingly Resilient, and it costs 2 command points if you have more than 3 Spawn there. I'd say that gaining Disgustingly Resilient is probably better than the +1 toughness, though both are helpful of course, and if they're primarily there just to take bullets and be a nice distraction unit, as Spawn typically are, this one seems a fairly reasonable pickup. It will mean that they soak up more heavy fire. Next we have Sickly Corrosion for 2 CP, which means if an enemy unit is hit by a plague weapon, then all other weapons in the Death Guard army reroll wound rolls of 1 until the end of the turn. This one is quite a potent buff against one enemy unit, provided you have a lot of other non-plague weapons that you're going to be firing at them. 2 CP is just perhaps a little bit steep for me for this. Maybe it could be worth it with something like Mephitic Blight Haulers with their multi-melters and missile launchers, or if you have an absolute ton of bolters. Next we have Belching Fumes, which is 1 or 2 CP from a Mephitic Blight Hauler unit. This one's quite a nice defensive stratagem. It costs 1 command point if you have 2 Mephitic Blight Haulers, or 2 command points if you have more. You have to do it at the start of your opponent's shooting phase, but it means that any weapons that are directed at those Blight Haulers will have -1 to the number of shots. This one's going to be most potent against any enemy weapons that have 2 shots each. It'll essentially make them doubly tough against things like twin las cannons. It is a bit annoying that you have to declare it at the start of the opponent's shooting phase though, rather than when they're targeted, as it does mean that your opponent can just choose to ignore them if they don't want to slog through this extra durability. Next we have Blight Bombardment, which was previewed by Warhammer Community. You have your Warlord Nominator point on the battlefield, and at the start of your next command phase, everyone within 6 inches will have a good chance of taking d3 mortal wounds. It's quite expensive at 3 command points, though it's only 2 if your Warlord happens to be a Lord of Virulence, and for me I'm a bit 50-50 on it. It does give your opponent a turn to get all their units out of the way if they want to, though it could be quite disruptive to have to do that if you do deploy this in the centre of your opponent's firebase. I'd say it is a lot more worth it at 2 command points for the Lord of Virulence, compared with the very expensive 3 command points if your Warlord is someone else. That is only the first half of Stratagems though, we have plenty more. First up, the Dead Walk again for 1 command point, allows you to roll 7 dice, and for each 3+ you resurrect a slain Poxwalker from a unit, meaning you're going to be averaging something like 4 or 5 Poxwalkers standing up again. Situationally could be quite handy, and you might even be able to gain a little bit of movement out of this, and maybe get them on an objective if it really matters. Next we have Cloud of Flies, which is either 2 command points on most units, or 4 command points on Terminators. A very hefty nerf on this. Games Workshop aren't wanting you to make Terminators untargetable, it would seem. This one's really quite a potent stratagem. It means a Death Guard infantry unit can't be shot if it's not the closest to enemy models, unless an enemy unit is within 12 inches of it, in which case it can still target it freely. I still say that this is potentially a very powerful stratagem to make your most important army to your strategy completely invincible for a turn against ranged attacks is really good, provided you've got some sort of screening units in front of it. Next we have Break Their Spirits for 1 command point, which is actually a surprisingly vicious leadership debuff. If a Terminator kills an infantry, beast or swarm model in melee, then that unit gets -4 to its leadership and is very likely to be running. Leadership's not super potent in 9th, but you could almost guarantee at least 1 model flees with this, and it really could be worth 1 CP. Next we have Dark Cravings, also 1 command point. This gives your bloat drone a heroic intervention at 6-inch movement. Not really the strongest combatants, though could be annoying to lock enemy units up, unless of course you have a flesh mower, in which case they are strong combatants and you should be afraid. Next we have Unclean Machine Spirit. This is 1 command point to count your vehicle as being on the top row of its vehicle damage profile, probably best used on something like a Defiler or a Plague Burst Crawler that's just hanging on to life. There's 1 command point for Befoul Incubators. You use this when a Death Guard character kills some infantry models. For each one that's slain on a 3+, you deal a mortal wound to that same enemy unit, though this can only be up to a maximum of 3. Again, it's going to be strongest against an enemy unit where you're pretty guaranteed to be killing multiple models. Next we have Release the Toxins for 2 command points, and you use this on a Death Guard character model with a relic. Any enemy units within 7 inches of this relic bearer will take 1 mortal wound on the roll of a 2 to 5, or d3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 6. 2 CP is a little bit steep, but if you do manage to somehow get a relic bearer into the absolute centre of your opponent's army, you could cause a fair bit of random death. For 1 command point we have Eruption of Filth. When a Death Guard character dies, you get a very similar aura of mortal wounds to that previous stratagem. It's only a 3-inch aura, and again for each enemy unit within 3 inches, you get 1 mortal wound on the roll of a 2 to 5, or d3 mortal wounds on a 6. I'd say you'd ideally want at least 2 units, probably 3 within range to make this worth it, where 1 command point for 3 mortal wounds randomly scattered could be kind of helpful. Might be particularly good on something like Mortarion or a Demon Prince, who have particularly big bases and might be in combat with multiple units. We then have Plague Chosen and Gifts of Decay. These are your standard extra Warlord Traits and extra Relic stratagems, 1 command point each, and you can have up to 2 extra Warlord Traits and 2 extra Relics at a 2000 point game. The main stipulation is that your Warlord has to have the Death Guard keyword, a restriction that we're seeing with most new codexes coming out now. It does mean that you can't, say, have a Demon detachment with allied Death Guard and be running around with their Warlord Traits and Relics now, I'm afraid. In a similar vein, we have 1 command point for Champion of Disease. This allows you to give one of your Plague Champions a relic. You can either have that Plague Skull one that gives you the close range mortal wounds, the boosted Power Sword Plague Bringer, the boosted Man Reaper, the Reaper of Entropy, or the Suppurating Plate Armor. Probably my pick would be the Reaper of Entropy on a Death Shroud champion. He gets 5 attacks and can make very good use out of it. Next, for 1 command point, we have Demonic Gluttony. This allows a Demon Engine to regain 1 mortal wound per enemy killed in the fight phase. I'm going to say that this has the most potential on a featured bloat drone with a flesh mower. With 12 attacks, that thing might well be killing multiple enemies per turn and regenerating you a ton of wounds. For 2 CP, we have Flash Outbreak. This makes your entire army's contagion abilities just a little bit further reaching. They count as 1 turn onwards on that chart. In addition, you can choose 1 unit to gain the Plague Company Warlord's Warlord Trait, each of which is also a contagion ability, so you could have that on a different unit on a different part of the battlefield. Say for example you could have that one with the droning that makes enemy units half their movement. I think it might be particularly useful on turn 3 when you can have your entire army jump up to a 9-inch contagion range. Next we have Putrid Detonation. This is the one to auto-explode a vehicle, but it now costs 2 CP if you're using it on a vehicle that's greater than 9 wounds. A little bit pricier and not as much of an automatic move. Again though, if you can be in the centre of multiple units, this could cause a lot of havoc. Foul Smokescreen is 1 command point, and a unit with the Smokescreen keyword gets -1 to hit, and you only have to deploy it when your enemy targets that unit. I noticed that the Defiler has the Smokescreen keyword, could be a good choice for that. Next, for 1 command point, we have the Blightening, which seems to have replaced the grenade throwing stratagem from the previous decks, where you could throw a whole ton of grenades with Plague Marine units. I'm afraid that this just isn't quite as strong as previously. It means you get to choose 3 different units from your army, and when each of those models throws a Blight Grenade, they'll get an automatic 6-shot Blight Grenade, and those 6 shots will automatically hit the enemy. I'm afraid that Mortal Wound Bomb with Blight Grenades is pretty much dead. It's probably strongest on 3 small units of Plague Marines, clustered around the character that gives them the extra Blight Grenade buff. You could get a solid amount of close range shooting with it. Next we have Overwhelming Generosity, which gives you +6 inches to Plague Weapon range. You can use this on any Death Guard unit, could be particularly helpful on say a bloat drone that's just out of Plague Spitter range. And you could even use it on bolters by combining it with the next stratagem, Virulent Rounds, which costs 1 command point, and it makes all your bolters in one core unit become plague weapons. I'm really quite glad that this one still exists, as it basically opens up all of the plague weapon synergies to the standard bolters in your army. Say you had a big 10-man squad of Blightlord Terminators deep striking, they could be getting 40 bolt shots a turn, make them plague weapons with this, and get full wound rerolls with the Arch Contaminator Warlord trait. There's lots of other potential buffs that you could also stack on that, depending on exactly how far you want to go with these murderous plague bolters. Finally, we have a Plague Burst Crawler enhancing stratagem called Disgusting Force. It makes your Plague Burst Mortar go to a flat damage 3, and if it does hit an enemy unit, then any enemy units within 3 inches take 1 mortal wound on the roll of a 4+. Again, like so many abilities in this codex, if the enemy army is really clustered up, this might be able to deal out a fair few mortal wounds on nearby units. So an absolute ton of stratagems for Death Guard there, many of which are very good or situationally very good, and lots of ways to put loads of mortal wounds all over the opponent's army. I think perhaps some of my favourites are the synergies that you can do with Plague Weapon Bolters, getting +1 to hit on a big unit of Terminators, and all of the ways that you could surprise your opponent with a ton of area effect mortal wounds. So let's move on to the 7 Plague Companies of the Death Guard now. Each detachment can nominate itself to be a Plague Company, which allows you to use their specific stratagem, take their Warlord traits, all of which are Contagion abilities, and also access their unique relic. You can't mix and match within a detachment, each detachment must be just literally from one Plague Company. The first Plague Company are the Harbingers, who are led by Typhus. Their Warlord trait is Shamble Rot, which Typhus gets himself, and non-vehicles in Contagion range at the start of the enemy movement phase have to roll a dice. On a 4+ they take 1 mortal wound, and on a 6 they take D3. Good to have a little bit of extra damage, but it does mean having Typhus right in the centre of your opponent's army just before they activate and maybe try and kill him back in return. Their relic is the Infected Remains, and it's an interesting one, allowing a character to permanently give an objective marker the Contagions of Nurgle ability when they're within 3-inch range of it. Even if the enemy takes the objective and wipes out all your Death Guard, they'll still be at -1 toughness. Perhaps a little bit annoying to deploy. Ideally you want this on one of the midfield objectives or the enemy home objective as early as possible, and while very fun, I'm just not sure it'll see play all that much. Their stratagem for 1 command point is the Wrathful Dead, and it'll help Typhus boost up those Poxwalkers, giving them rerolls to hit, as well as the +1 strength that he gives them. If you can attack with a max unit, could be worth it, and I would pretty much exclusively use this in combination with the one to make Poxwalkers give you a 6 to hit being a mortal wound. 20 Poxwalkers with both of these should give you something like 10 mortal wounds damage output, which is pretty crazy. Next up we have the Inexorable, who have the Warlord trait Ferric Blight. If any Inexorable units attack an enemy within Contagion range of this Warlord, their attacks will be AP -1 better. It means that your Warlord's going to be wanting to be right up front against the enemy. It'll make all of their melee attacks that bit better, and it could be really helpful with supporting things like Bolterfire, getting AP -1 against nearby units. Their relic is the Leech Spore Casket. If the bearer kills models in melee, then it'll heal a friendly Inexorable Demon Engine 1 wound within 18 inches, up to 3 wounds per turn. Not bad if the character is advancing alongside Demon Engines. Finally, their 1 CP stratagem is Ferric Miasma. You use it when one of the Inexorable units is charged, and it gives the enemy a -2 to charge debuff. This one's particularly potent out of Deep Strike, as it means that any enemies that are arriving 9 inches away will really struggle to get in, even if they have other buffs. Overall, I think that the Inexorable are quite a good combination. Their Warlord trait and stratagem both seem very good. Next we have Mortarion's Anvil, whose trait is the Gloaming Bloat. It means that enemies within Contagion range can't overwatch, and they can't reroll hits or wounds either. Probably not my favourite out of these Contagion Warlord traits. Their relic is far better though. The Warp Insect Hive is pretty much ideal for a fighty character. It allows the Warlord to reroll hits and wounds in melee, making him just a massively better combatant against basically everything. Could be really nice to combine with a weapon with one of those Deadly Pathogens abilities to really take him to the next level. Their stratagem is 1 command point for Relaptic Assault. At the end of the enemy charge phase, you get to select 1 enemy unit, and all Mortarion Anvil units can heroically intervene 3 inches into that unit. Most of the time it just basically amounts to a free heroic intervention for one of your units, but occasionally you might be able to get 2 or more in. That one's really quite a useful ability to have in the back pocket. It means that enemies aren't just going to be able to get right up to you without engaging you in combat. Next we come to the Wretched, whose Warlord trait is the Eater Plague. Again, that can both buff the Warlord and other Wretched that are out of Contagion range, as any enemy units that are in contagion range of the Warlord, when they're targeted by an attack made by the Wretched, any hit rolls of 6 will auto-wound the enemy. Again, this is quite nice with bolt weapons, or indeed anything that's quite low strength. The Wretched are presided over by a demon who rewards psychers, and fittingly their relic is the demon's favour. This one's a relic for the Malignant Plague caster, and it basically boosts up his ability to cause mortal wounds. If he casts a psychic power on the roll of a 7 or more, then the enemy units within 12 inches get D3 mortal wounds. It basically means he's going to get a free smite out of each cast, provided he's up close and personal. Even if you don't manage to get a 7+, though, if the enemy unit's within 6 inches, it still spits out 1 mortal wound. I'm not necessarily sure that you want your plague casters engaging the enemy quite so close, but honestly this could make him into a bit of a damage-dealing buffing machine. Finally, for 1 CP we have the Sevenfold Blessings. This is a pre-game upgrade for a Psyker. It allows him to know 1 extra psychic power, and he can re-roll a psychic test each turn. Quite useful for if he's either trying to pass one, or even just as avoid a perils. If you really want your Psykers to be the best of the best, then the Wretched are a pretty decent choice. Next we have the Poxmongers. Their Warlord trait is the Sanguous Flux. It's a contagion that gives -1 leadership and -1 combat attrition. For me, leadership debuffs are still just a little bit situational. I guess maybe if you could combine it with the Terminator one that gives enemies -4 leadership, at least they're going to fail those tests and hopefully take some morale casualties. Their relic is the Ironclot Furnace. This has been nerfed since the previous edition. You now have to select 1 demon engine in your command phase, and that demon engine gets a 4+ invul save. I'd say it's still good, but nowhere near as potent as it was when you could get it on multiple demon engines at once. Their stratagem is Bilious Blood Rush, 1 command point, and it's basically a buff to demon engines that have been locked up in melee. It allows you to fire your blast weapons into the melee that you're fighting in, which is good for Plague Burst Crawlers with those mortars, and it also gives you +1 to hit those enemy units that are in engagement range. Quite a nice option for Defilers as well, as they're going to be seeking out melee. I would say though that the Poxmongers are likely not going to be taking quite as much. Not as much of an auto-include as previously, but they're still decent for a demon engine sort of army list. Next up, and possibly one of the best picks, are the Ferrymen. This is because of their Warlord trait, the Droning, being ridiculously potent now. This Contagion gives all enemy units within contagion range half their movement characteristic, and can really screw with the positioning of a large chunk of the enemy army. I'd say that this one could be an excellent trait to give Mortarion out of one of his choices of the Plague Company's Warlord traits. He gets a 9-inch aura of this on a really large base, and if you can get him into the enemy lines, then it means your opponent's army is just not going to be going anywhere fast. It's honestly just so disruptive, will prevent your opponent from being able to move normally, and perhaps might be one of the strongest abilities in the new Death Guard Codex. Their relic I wouldn't say is quite as overwhelming. The Ferryman's Scythe is a Man Reaper which has 3 times attacks on its Scythe profile, which is Strength 5, AP -1, Damage 1. I guess it does mean that you could be getting 18 attacks with that profile, so it would turn them into an anti-horde monster, but frankly they're already quite good against hordes, and a lot of the time you'll be wanting to use the main profile of it against more heavily armoured targets. Finally, their stratagem is pretty useful. On Droning Wings gives you +6 inches to one of the elite support characters' aura buffs. Again, could be really handy for a massive aura of Feel No Pain from the Plague Surgeon. You would have to pay for it each turn that you wanted it though, it's not just an all-game thing. Finally, we have Mortarion's Chosen Sons, whose trait is Nurgle's Fruit, which gives Mortarion's Chosen Sons units ignores cover on units within range. Sort of okay, but does rely on your opponent being in cover for it to have any effect. Their relic is Vomitrix, which is a Plague Spewer that is 12 inches, Assault 7, Strength 7, AP -3 and Damage 2, and auto hits the enemy. Sorry, I have got that slightly wrong there. It is a Plague Sprayer, not a Plague Spewer. The one that the Foul Blightspawn gets. Basically, you're getting it from an average of 3.5 hits per Plague Sprayer attack to an automatic 7, and it's really quite a solid upgrade on this one if you're not taking that +10 points for Viscous Death. Finally, their command point is Plague Brewers, and it basically makes any Plague Belchers, Plague Spewers and Plague Gauntlets damage 2 from a round of shooting. Though to be honest, there aren't all that many units that can spam these to any great extent. I guess it might be most useful on a unit of Death Shroud Terminators, who at least have quite a lot of Plague Spurt Gauntlets. Overall from these, I think that the single most powerful rule is the Ferryman's Droning trait, though I am pleased to say that pretty much every Plague Company has something that's really useful and could give you a different fun twist on the Death Guard army. I really quite like the Wrathful Dead in combination with that mutating strain to give lots of mortal wounds out of Poxwalkers. The Inexorable all seem to have a solid Warlord trait and very decent stratagem, and Mortarion's Anvil seem like a decent choice as well, from heroic intervention and having a very fighty character with that relic. Now before we get into datasheets, let's talk about the unique secondaries of the Death Guard. This time we have 3. 2 that seem sort of whatever, and 1 battlefield supremacy one that seems very easy to achieve. First though, we have Fleeing Vectors, which is a no mercy one. This one gives you 3 victory points at the end of the battle round if any enemy unit fails a morale test that was injured by plague weapons this turn. Very fluffy. I guess the idea is that they spread the disease far and wide, but it sounds a bit unreliable to make happen with any sort of reliability, unless maybe you're playing a very low leadership army with lots of small units, such as Imperial Guard perhaps. The one that I think is really good is Despoiled Ground, which is a battlefield supremacy one, where you have the option to get quite a lot of victory points if you can have your Death Guard units all over the board at the end of the final battle round. Basically you just need quite a lot of your Death Guard army to survive, and then you'll be pretty much guaranteed a ton of victory points. First up, you get 4 victory points if you have a unit both in your deployment zone and the enemy deployment zone, then another 4 if you have a unit in each of 3 table quarters, or 6 victory points if you have 1 in all 4, another 4 victory points if you control more than half the objective markers, and finally another 4 if every objective marker is within contagion range, which might not be all that hard to achieve as you'll have 9-inch contagion range at this point. Basically you'll score really big on this one if you have basically beaten the opponent back, but even if you hadn't, with really hardy tough Death Guard units, you might well be able to have enough surviving to score a very decent amount with this. I think your opponent's really going to struggle to stop you having a unit in 3 different table quarters, and perhaps 1 in each deployment zone too. Death Guard units are just really tough. Finally, we have Shadow Operations, which has one where you contaminate objectives called Spread the Sickness. It's an action that can be done by Death Guard infantry units. You do it at the end of your movement phase when you're less than 3 inches away from an objective marker, and you can choose to either roll a dice, it goes off on a 4+, or you can take D3 mortal wounds to automatically succeed the action. You get 3 victory points for each objective marker you manage to do this to. For me, I think that this one's kind of interesting. If you have 6 objectives on the board, you might well be able to get it off on quite a few of them, but realistically you're going to have to eat a fair few mortal wounds to auto-succeed these. You really don't want to be failing an action after your unit stood around for a turn. It's still probably not the easiest one to max. Overall, I really think that Despoiled Ground is probably the strongest of these. It really capitalises on Death Guard units just having to survive the game, which with all the insane durability of this codex, they're really not going to find too hard to do. So now let's get into the Death Guard datasheets then, and we'll kick off with the new models, the Lord of Virulence and Miasmic Malignifier. The Lord of Virulence is an 120 point model, and it's basically a very fighty character who does have the normal buff of a Chaos Lord, and also helps you out a little bit with ranged plague weapons. I'll admit I was pretty concerned when I saw his main unit buff. I was thinking it might not be very useful, but Games Workshop have been nice to him. They have given him the standard reroll ones to hit for core Death Guard units within 6 inches. He is looking decently strong. For your 120 points, you get an HQ choice with Movement 5, Weapon Skill and Ballistic Skill 2+, Strength 4, Toughness 5, 6 wounds, 5 attacks, Leadership 9 and a 2+ save, and he does have a 4+ invul save as well from that Cataphractii Terminator armour, just the same as all the other Terminators in the army list. He'll buff your nearby Death Guard units with reroll ones to hit, with the extra quirk that any core unit's ranged plague weapons will get an extra pip of AP on the wound roll of a 6. That buff isn't the strongest, I'll admit, but it combines quite nicely with the Virulent Round stratagem for Plague Marine Bolters, and when taken on top of the reroll ones to hit, I think it's actually quite good. I think his main appeal really just comes from him being a souped up Chaos Lord with some really decent war gear though. He gets a Twin Plague Spewer, which is a 12-inch range 2d6 shot weapon with Strength 5, AP -1 and Damage 1, and it's a Plague weapon, and that really is quite fearsome shooting for an infantry character. He's no slouch in melee either. He does have a Power Fist with a Plague Weapon special rule called a Plague Claw. As you'd expect, he gets disgustingly resilient Contagions of Nurgle and Teleport Strike, and he does have that Lord of the Death Guard keyword, meaning that you have to choose between him, Demon Princes, and other Chaos Lords. Overall though, I think he's really solid, and I'm glad that Games Workshop have come out with a nice model and given it some solid rules, so if you do include it in the army, you're not really handicapping yourself. Next up we have the Miasmic Malignifier, which I think might just be a case of Games Workshop making a fortification that's actually usable and fairly competitive. It doesn't happen often, but I think that this thing has enough special rules and annoyance factor to make it worth an include. It's 75 points, and it's certainly not trivial to take out with Toughness 8, 12 wounds and a 3+ save. This thing's basically an annoying sort of area denial fortification that can make nearby Death Guard units that bit tougher, and also debuff enemy units. Probably the most important thing is that it had its seeded growth special rule, which means that it can set up 12 inches away from the enemy deployment zone, so you can put it somewhere in the midfield, and even potentially use it to screen out units such as Space Marine infiltrators or other units that can set up in the midfield. Honestly, I think that these things could be really annoying if you just plonk them down on the midfield objectives. they're going to be giving your opponent a hard time. First up, if the enemy gets too close to them, they have a reasonably nice flamer attack, which means that enemy infantry just can't afford to get too close. It's only 6-inch range, but their noxious stink is heavy 2d6, strength 4, AP -1 and damage 1, so it'll clear out something like the best part of a guardsman squad each turn. It does auto hit the enemy as well. It's a good source of the Contagions of Nurgle debuff, always going off at 9-inch range, so if the enemy units approach the objective that it's on, then it's going to be at -1 toughness. If your Death Guard units move up to take said objective, it's going to give them light cover, and if they can happen to have the benefit of light cover from nearby terrain, it'll make them -1 to hit instead. Finally, if the enemy does decide to try and charge and kill this thing, which is going to be extra hard due to their disgustingly resilient rule, it's got a pretty decent chance for a putrid explosion, where on a 4+, non-Nurgle units within 6 inches will suffer D3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 4+. If you really want these mortal wounds as well, because there's loads of enemies nearby, you can auto-explode it with that stratagem as well. Finally, that little second part is called a pox furnace. It doesn't really count as part of the fortification, but you just set it up nearby. It's basically a little bit of terrain that gives you light cover, and I think you could actually use it for blocking movement lanes for enemy vehicles. If the Malignifier itself is removed, then the pox furnace is removed as well. I'm not going to lie, these things sound really annoying to deal with. You're not going to want to shoot them because of how tough they are, but the enemy army is going to be paying a hefty price if they want to try and claim any objectives that they're sitting near, and if you can move up with your Death Guard units, it's going to make them tougher for being nearby. I do think that we'll start seeing some of these appear in competitive Death Guard lists, quite likely 1, maybe 2. So let's move on to the rest of the Codex then, starting with HQ choices, and we'll be mainly focusing on things that have changed on the previous incarnation. Demon Princes are down a little in points. They're 140 points base now, or plus 35 with wings, though I'd say the wings are now a bit more of a questionable choice. They only seem to give you 10-inch movement and the fly keyword. That's only +2 on standard, and I'd be quite tempted to leave them off now. I'm afraid his talons have got nerfed slightly as well. They're only AP -1, and only grant +2 attacks if you have a pair of them. I think we're going to see more Demon Princes running around with swords, as the swords have gone up to strength 8, and with the Contagions of Nurgle making toughness 8 things go down to toughness 7, the sword will be basically wounding everything on the roll of a 3+. Still very solid though, knows a Plague Discipline psychic power, a very potent melee stat line, quite fast, and also gives nearby units reroll 1s. I think Demon Princes remain a very decent choice for the Death Guard, probably as more of a slower moving walking threat wandering up the board. Typhus has seen an absolute ton of changes as well. He's 165 points now, though he's going to be hitting a little bit less accurately with his Man Reaper, as Man Reapers and Plague Reapers in general are now -1 to hit. In recompense, they do gain a Scythe special mode, which will make them extra good against infantry. You effectively get double the attacks, and they're at strength +1, AP -1, and damage 1 now. He's gone up to 6 attacks now, so he's still going to be a beast of a melee unit both against vehicles and now infantry as well. His Poxwalker buff no longer gives +1 toughness to them, it's just +1 strength, and his Destroyer Hive ability has changed. Rather than being a shooting attack, it now gives you a 2+ chance to give D3 mortal wounds to an enemy unit in the command phase. I'd say that's probably better than the weak shooting attack that it had previously. He does now have the Lord of Contagion keyword, so it's essentially a unique version of a Lord of Contagion, and he gets their special rule which is +3 to his Contagion abilities range, which will include that Shamble Rot Plague that he has if he does happen to be the Warlord. Finally, you can include him in any Death Guard detachment without breaking the Plague Company special rule, even though technically he's a Harbinger's model. On top of that, he can still manifest 2 psychic powers as well, so he's not bad as a Psyker either. Again, just generally pretty solid all round I think. You're really not going to want to get in Typhus's way, and it's not going to be easy to kill either. As for other HQ choices, both Chaos Lords and Death Guard Sorcerers have gained +1 toughness and disgustingly resilient. Again, Chaos Lords are now restricted by the Lord of the Death Guard restriction, which really means you're going to have to choose between all these choices. The Lord of Contagion, much like the Lord of Virulence, has gained a reroll 1s aura, much like the standard Chaos Lord, and as with Typhus, he gets +3 to his Contagion abilities, and is looking like another interesting choice compared with the Lord of Virulence. He's more melee focused, where the Lord of Virulence has that very nice Plague Flamer. If your Lord of Contagion takes a Man Reaper, he now gets an extra boost with a once per game grenade attack called an Orb of Desiccation. 3d3 shots with a grenade with strength 4, AP -1 and damage 2, and of course it is a plague weapon. Finally, the Plague Caster's got a couple of buffs. He's now down to 95 points, he's gained +1 strength on his staff attack, and for that mortal wound that he spits out whenever he casts on a 7 or more, the range has increased to 12 inches. I think that the Death Guard HQ choices are looking really solid right now. None of them really seem bad at all. I'd be most tempted by a Demon Prince, Typhus, or the Lord of Virulence myself. I would bear in mind though that you're going to have to use a sorcerer or a malignant plague caster if you are wanting to fill out a battalion rather than a patrol. They're the only other choices that don't have the Lord of the Death Guard keyword. Next up we have the troops, and it's generally good news for the Codex for the Plague Marines, who have gone up to 2 wounds and are only 21 points. They also have 2 attacks base rather than Hateful Assault, so they're no slouches in melee, further buffed by the new Contagions of Nurgle giving everything -1 toughness, and Plague Knives becoming AP -1 plague weapons now. They'll always be rapid firing with the bolters if you take them, but if you do take 2 plague combat weapons of one sort or another, then they'll get 3 attacks rather than 2. It means that a Plague Marine unit with 2 Plague Knives and going with various melee buffs is actually pretty viable. They're going to be very durable to enemies attacking them, and they're just going to grind away at them in return. One thing I have noticed though is that the Plague Flail has been nerfed a little bit. It's now strength 5, AP -2 and 2 damage, though the extra wounds no longer spill over and cause additional damage if it does overkill an enemy model, which means it just isn't quite as strong, though it has dropped in points a bit. For the other troops, Poxwalkers are down to 5 points, they get toughness 4, and as a surprise extra bonus they also have a 6+ feel no pain. As we mentioned previously, you can't spam an army of nothing but Poxwalkers, you do need some other core Death Guard choices as well, but for only 50 points for quite such a durable infantry unit, these guys are looking really solid. With the feel no pain, toughness 4 and auto passing morale, they're pretty much ideal chaff units. They can sit on the objectives and hold them while everything else goes in for the kill. They're also a little bit better in melee, hitting on 4s, have that stratagem for some mortal wounds if they really need it. They do get obsec, but their only restriction is that they can't do actions, as they're a bit mindless. It is worth being aware that they aren't core units as well, so won't be getting any reroll 1s from Death Guard Lords. Still though, I think that they're a really solid choice. Maybe investing in 3 small units of these to help out with the objective game could be a really annoying thing for your opponent, as they're really not going to want to bother to try and clear them. Finally, we come to Cultists, who are also down to 5 points, the same as Poxwalkers, though honestly I don't think are anywhere near as good. Unless I'm missing something, I think they can do actions, but they don't get objectives secured for some reason. For a chaff unit, I think that the Poxwalkers are just quite a lot better. Their toughness 4 and feel no pain makes them more durable, which is what you want a cheap chaff unit to be. I don't think a smattering of ranged damage output with strength 3 attacks is really worth the durability loss. In general though, I think it's really good for the Death Guard troops. Plague Marines are looking better than ever and are supported with some good strats and some good support characters, which we'll get onto in just a second. And Poxwalkers are really efficient chaff units, even if you can't literally field something like 200 or 300 of them anymore. Next we move on to the Elites choices, and here are the members of the Feated Virion, the ones that you can take 3 different choices of in one Elite slot. These are all of the minor named Death Guard support characters, and again they've seen some interesting buffs and tweaks. Most of them are more usable than ever, and I'd say that they can all have a role if you want them in your list. First up we have the Noxious Blightbringer, which gives a 6-inch aura of -1 combat attrition to enemies, and -1 for enemies casting psychic powers. He adds +1 movement to your core units and Virion units. I'd say that this is probably one of the best reasons to take him. Death Guard are a bit slow, and this does help address one of their weaknesses. His Plague Bell is also -1 AP as well now. Next we have the Foul Blightspawn, who's 75 points, down from 85. I'm afraid he has taken probably the biggest nerfs out of these guys though. His Plague Sprayer is only damage 2, though it has gone up to 12-inch range, and it is a flat strength 7 all the time. Not quite as much an anti-everything weapon, but it's still a really good choice for that Viscous Death upgrade. For 10 extra points I would usually take that, making the weapon strength 8 and allowing to reroll the number of shots each time you fire it. He also has some Death's Head grenades that he can throw. These could be good if he's firing at a lot of light infantry. It's assault 2d6, strength 5 and AP -1, so pretty potent. But I'm afraid his Revolting Stench ability, the one that breaks enemy charges and means that your Death Guard units can fight first, has been nerfed. I'm afraid it's now a mere 3-inch range rather than 7-inch range, so it's mainly going to apply if he gets to heroically intervene into the enemy army, or if they choose to deliberately target him. It's going to be easier just to protect one unit with this guy now, rather than protecting a whole ton of them. I'd say he's still usable, though obviously weaker than before. Next we have the Biologus Putrefier. He is 65 points, and he's the Blight Grenade buffing guy, though he has lost a bit of relevance now you can't have an entire squad throw out Blight Grenades. He makes nearby Death Guard units Blight Grenades go to AP -1 and damage 2, so this is now going to be stronger on multiple small units of Death Guard, rather than one big one using the strats. However, I would say that now this isn't the core point of him, and he's gained another really good special rule. In the command phase he gets to nominate one core Death Guard unit, and their plague weapons get an excellent buff. 6s to wound in the fight phase will cause mortal wounds. Basically this is the guy that you want next to a big squad of Plague Marines armed with Plague Knives. Say you had a unit of Plague Marines with bolters and Plague Knives. use the Trench Fighter's stratagem to get 30 attacks. On average you're going to be getting something like 3 or 4 mortal wounds in addition to their normal damage. A really solid melee buff this one, and I'd be very tempted to have him if you're taking some big units of Plague Marines. It's the last two of these characters though that are really catching my eye right now. First up we have the Tallyman, who's gone up to 70 points from 60, and now he's an excellent buffing character who also generates command points very reliably. First up, rather than providing full hit rerolls in melee, he now gets to nominate a unit in the command phase, and that unit just gets +1 to hit for the entire turn. Imagine that on a big unit of Terminators slogging up the board, firing away with bolters on a 2+ to hit, and then being exceptionally accurate in melee as well. In addition, he gets that command farming ability. Each command phase you roll 2d6, and if you roll a 7+, then you gain a command point. On average, that's going to be good for about 3 command points over the course of a 5-turn game. I will be wanting to take that Tollkeeper relic that he can get, the one that gives you exploding 6s to hit with ranged weapons, and just point for point it becomes one of the best bolter buffing characters in the game. Say he uses it on a unit of 20 Plague Marines with bolters, they can move 5 inches and rapid fire for 40 bolt shots. In normal circumstances that'd be about 27 hits. With a combination of his normal buff plus Tollkeeper, they'll actually be averaging about 40 hits due to the exploding 6s. Really good when you get command point farming thrown on top of that. Then of course you can go to town with things like making the bolters plague weapons as well, and maybe even have a Arch-Contaminator Warlord nearby. Finally, last but not least, and also excellent value, is the Plague Surgeon. He's very similar to the Space Marine Apothecary now, albeit without the stratagems, but frankly he doesn't need them to be great. Units within 3 inches will get a 6+ Feel No Pain, which when stacked with Disgustingly Resilient will make things just incredibly hard to shift, and also each turn he can also heal D3 wounds on a nearby infantry squad. Absolutely superb to have in the core of your army, and a good bearer of that Fulgaris Helm relic, so that Feel No Pain buff can go all the way out to 6 inches. I'd say for the most part these guys are real winners of the Codex. I think it could be really fun running a Plague Surgeon and Tallyman up alongside some big advancing units of Plague Marines or Terminators. They're going to be horribly resilient and put out a withering hail of bolt shots. Let's move on to the rest of the elites now, and the Death Guard Terminators, who as we've been mentioning a bit in this review so far, really are some of the ones to watch. First up, Warlord Terminators are looking ridiculously efficient. They've dropped 3 points down to 40 points, while also gaining a wound, so they're Toughness 5 3-wound models with a 2+ save and a 4+ invul. Almost nothing in the game is going to be efficient at removing these now, and they're particularly resistant to damage 2 weapons due to Disgustingly Resilient. They'll be reliably spitting out a fair amount of damage with those combi bolters, and Bale Swords are now Strength 5 plague weapons with the Power Sword rules. They'll be merrily chopping away at the enemy turn after turn. I'll admit that their damage output isn't super stellar, but with their defensive profile such as it is, it really doesn't have to be. They can stomp forward turn after turn, kicking out a really decent number of bolt shots, and be a massive melee threat should the opponent get too close. If you do want the more dangerous melee damage output Terminators though, then the Death Shroud are probably for you. They've gone up to 50 points from 47, and they've gained Weapon Skill 2+, though the Man Reapers kind of counteract that by being -1 to hit. Death Shroud Terminators now have a whopping 4 attacks base, and the champion has 5, so pretty much as before, anything that they touch in melee is going to break into little bits, particularly with -1 toughness thanks to Contagions of Nurgle. They're no longer slouches at anti-horde, with the Man Reapers getting that anti-horde mode for double the attacks at Strength 5 AP -1. Their Plague Spurt Gauntlets are more useful out of Deep Strike, getting 12-inch range, and they've gained an interesting little unit upgrade called Chimes of Contagion, 15 points for +3 inches to their Contagion range. Finally, they can protect infantry characters less than 9 wounds. They can't be targeted by ranged weapons when they're next to the Death Shroud, though they won't be able to tank wounds from Mortarion anymore. Rounding off the elite section, we have the Hellbrute at 115 points. He's got a couple of new rules that I'm sure we'll see in the main Codex Chaos Space Marines as well. When he's wounded, he now rerolls all wound rolls of 1, so he gets a little bit fightier, and he has -1 damage due to a rule called Monstrous Resilience, which is instead of Disgustingly Resilient. I think that will be present in the Chaos decks as well, similar to the Loyalist's Duty Eternal. In addition, he does have Contagions of Nurgle, and he is a core unit, so he can profit from rerolls. He certainly seems better than before, though I'm not sure he's going to outshine the Demon Engines. Finally, for another quite improved unit, we have Death Guard Possessed. These are up to 24 points from 20, though I think they're pretty much equally tough, as they're now Toughness 5 and have Disgustingly Resilient, as well as their nice 5+ invul save. 2 damage attacks just aren't going to be very efficient against them anymore, and they've got significantly fightier in melee as well. They have a flat 4 attacks each, at Strength 5, AP -2 and Damage 1. Most importantly, they are a core Death Guard unit, so they can receive various different melee buffs, including things to plague weapons, as their tentacles are now plague weapons as well. I would say despite going up in points, I think they're still winners of this change. Toughness 5 and Disgustingly Resilient are really big wins, and they're going to be far more dangerous when they make their attacks back. Could be interesting with a fair few of them hopping out of a Rhino, though you can only fit 5 of them in there now, you can't fit 10. Really though, I think it's both flavours of Terminators that are the stars of the show. They're just ludicrously durable, and few armies are going to have a reliable answer for them. Next up we move on to the Death Guard Fast Attack, a smaller section this one. Spawn are still 23 points, and they're pretty much unchanged from before. They now have 2d3 attacks, but they lost Hateful Assault, so if anything they might be a little bit weaker. I guess you can spend the extra command point to give them Toughness 6 and Disgustingly Resilient if you are running a big unit, and they could be a pretty handy distraction. However, they might just be best as junk annoyance units, things to stand in table quarters and win objectives, or just do nuisance charges on enemy units that don't want to be in combat. Blight Haulers in the fast attack section have received unfortunately a very hefty points increase, though they've got quite a lot of nice abilities in return, and they put out decent anti-tank fire with 2 melter shots and 1 missile launcher shot, and toughness wise they went up to 9 wounds, so are a little bit more durable there. Perhaps more importantly though, at range they are now always -1 to hit. They basically swapped out their rule giving cover saves to nearby Death Guard infantry for making themselves far more durable against enemy range threats. I think that these guys are quite interesting, though they perhaps might not shape up to Plague Burst Crawlers, as they're not all that many points fewer than them now. I suspect of the two, the Plague Burst Crawlers are probably going to win out with toughness 8 and 12 wounds, though -1 to hit is very nice. Their melee is not quite as potent as before, they only damage 1 in melee, they do get 4 attacks, and that Trilobe special rule giving them +1 to hit is unfortunately gone. After the fast attack section, I'd say the winners are in fact the Bloat Drones. They're 130 points with those dual Plague Spitters, and being fairly fast they can move up into the opponent's faces, and hopefully get that Contagions of Nurgle ability going nice and early. The Plague Spitters don't vary in strength anymore, they're always strength 6, so if they're in Contagion range, they'll pretty much always be wounding Space Marines on 2s, rerolling 1s. That Flesh Mower is looking really appealing as well now. It's 12 attacks at strength 7, AP -2 and damage 2. Unlike all the other demon engines, the Bloat Drones hit on 3 now, and they don't degrade anymore, as they only have 9 wounds, so don't have a damage table. I'd say point for point they seem like quite an efficient little threat. I think I'd be most tempted by the Flesh Mower. The thing's really solid melee, and is particularly quite good against Space Marines with damage 2. Next we have the Death Guard Heavy Support, headed up by the Plague Burst Crawler, which I'd describe as a very efficient and very durable tank at 165 points, for 12 wounds of toughness 8 with -1 damage and a 5+ invul. Now the version with the Plague Spitters is the cheaper option. The entropy cannons cost +5 points each, which I think is to take into account the fact that it's ballistic skill 3+, so they're that bit more accurate, and they also have D3+3 damage, so are really quite venomous anti-tank weapons. The Plague Burst Mortar has that flat damage 2, which you can make damage 3 with the Stratagem if you want to, and the Rot-Tail Volley Gun has seen a bit of a buff as well. It's now 24-inch range, rapid fire 3, strength 6, AP -1, damage 1, so is significantly more damaging than the Heavy Slugger at close range. It's not a core unit anymore though, so I'm afraid you're no longer getting any rerolls for things like Warlord Traits or reroll 1s to hit from Lords. For the more standard Space Marine vehicles, Land Raiders and Predators are pretty much unchanged, though weirdly, like the Space Marine Loyalist counterparts, the Predator tanks have been separated out into Predator Destructors and Predator Annihilators. Not really too sure why that really needed to happen, to be honest. And Rhinos in the dedicated transport section have gone up to 80 points, and all of these tanks have gained Contagions of Nurgle, so can provide that aura of -1 toughness. Finally, for the heavy support though, the Defiler is now 165 points base, so it has gone up a fair bit in points cost, mainly to take into account 4 weapon skill and ballistic skill 3, and the fact that the Defiler Battle Cannon is now a flat damage 3. I'm afraid it doesn't have Disgustingly Resilient, but it does have the Smokescreen keyword, so you can use that stratagem for -1 to hit if it happens to be threatened. Out of these guys, the Plague Burst Crawler and the Defiler both look useful. Plague Burst Crawlers are just monstrously tough and be chipping away with their ignores line of sight damage all game long, and Defilers are far more threatening, if maybe a little bit less tough than you could make them in the previous decks. Finally, last but by no means least, we have Mortarion himself. This guy might just be one of the most threatening units in the whole Death Guard army. He's just got so many special rules and buffs now that he's pretty much guaranteed to cause a massive headache for your opponents. He's 490 points or 25 power, a Lord of War choice for Codex Death Guard, and he's got that Supreme Commander trait, which means that if you put him in a Supreme Command detachment, it won't cost you any more command points. He's got a 12-inch movement, weapon skill and ballistic skill 2+, strength 8, notably toughness 8, which is an increase, and 7 attacks. He is now incredibly tough to kill, with a 4+ invul save, and provided he is your Warlord, which I think he will normally be as he gets those 3 traits that we mentioned earlier, he has a 5+ Feel No Pain save as well. That's on top of Disgustingly Resilient, which also makes him -1 damage. Mortarion is just one of the most durable models in the entire game. You'll typically take a lot more firepower to bring this guy down compared with an Imperial Knight. In melee, there are a few units that he's not going to go through in a single turn with Silence, his big scythe. He can either choose to strike at Strength 16, AP -3, and damage D3+3, which should kill just about any enemy heavy out there, or he can go at Strength 8, AP -2 and damage 1, and get a crazy 21 attacks. His Lantern Pistol's a little bit more short-ranged on previous, still spits out one decent anti-tank shot per turn though, and can potentially hit multiple enemy units. Those Phosphex bombs are unchanged, 2d6 strength 5 attacks at AP -1, and he gets a few random extra strength 2 attacks in combat, as if that matters. In terms of buffs, he gains buffs similar to a Space Marine Chapter Master. All Death Guard units that are core will be rerolling 1s near him, and he can pick one core unit to get 4 rerolls on top of that. His other 2 set Warlord traits means that enemy units can't make use of aura abilities when they're within 3 inches of him, which is really going to hamper things like Space Marines trying to countercharge him. And he also gets that Arch Contaminator Warlord trait, which means nearby Death Guard core units are going to get full rerolls to wound with their plague weapons. Finally, and perhaps even more scarily, he gets a free plague trait of your choice, one of the ones from the 7 plague companies. I'd usually make it the one that halves enemy movement distance. His contagion range is always 9 inches as well, so if you can put Mortarion somewhere in the centre of the board, then any advancing enemy units are going to be far slower until they can get rid of Mortarion. At the moment, Mortarion honestly sounds horrible to fight against, and I think he's going to make a dramatic appearance in quite a lot of Death Guard lists. I think his durability has reached the point where even if a large chunk of the enemy army decides to focus on him turn 1, he's still unlikely to go down to one hail of fire. He's absolutely monstrous, and nothing short of a huge amount of dedicated anti-tank fire is going to bring him down. So overall, I think that this new Codex Death Guard is looking very potent indeed, and I think that it is going to propel them to near the top of the competitive rankings in 40k. Loads of strong options here. Most of the HQs are really usable. Those Virion members for buffing Plague Marines and Terminators are great. Blightlord Terminators in particular seem really undercosted, and Mortarion himself is absolutely horrifying. As expected, I think the main strength is going to lie in the sheer durability of the army. Stacking Terminators with -1 damage, maybe -1 to hit from Miasma of Pestilence, and a 6+ Feel No Pain from a Plague Surgeon is just going to mean they can march up the board, more or less do what they like, take the objectives, and deal damage to the enemy all game long. I'm going to be really interested to see just how much of an impact they make, and what sort of lists competitive players come up with. We'll hopefully be covering a fair few more Death Guard videos on the channel in the coming weeks, and I'll be looking to review the Crusade contents of the Codex in the near future. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see any of that, or just check back later for more videos. Finally, if you have found the video useful, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page which you can find down in the video description. Making videos, particularly massive Codex reviews like this, does take a serious amount of time, so if you are enjoying, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry to the channel's regular prize draws with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.